Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Walking Talking mock lessons that I've produced. This is going to be a Walking Talking mock feedback lesson based on AQA Language Paper 1, the June 2017 series. So to start with, we're going to focus on question 1 of section A, easiest question on the paper. And I'm just going to go through a few key points that as a teacher and an examiner that we consider when we're marking this. So there's a generous application of the mark scheme. And what that means is we are generous rather than sort of cautious. So we're looking to always reward marks where we possibly can. Our job is not to try and punish you guys, but it's actually to try and give you marks for the work that you've done. So marks are given for all relevant details from the mark scheme. You can get more than 1 mark per line if you've got, say, 2 or 3 details that are correct on the mark scheme and that are separate. So basically what that means is you could essentially get all 4 marks just from 1 line of your answer. And that's why we always encourage you to sort of write in full phrases or full sentences and not just 1 or 2 words, because you can get more than 1 mark per line. The indicative content that I mark your work with is indicative. That means that the teacher or examiner should make sure that they use points from the section, even if they're not on the mark scheme, and that they're correct. I think on average, the average sort of result for this is about 3.5 out of 4. So you should be looking to get 3 or 4 marks on this to sort of make sure you're matching up with the rest of the country or the rest of your class in terms of the marks you're getting. So have a little look at the mark scheme on the bottom right-hand corner here, and you've got a chance now to self-assess the exam that you've done or having a go at. If you haven't done that, obviously you need to watch part 1 of this video series and give the exam a go. So the correct answers that you could have got marks for are: she bought a bunch of violets, she had a scone, a boiled egg, and a cup of cocoa for tea. She worked in a hat shop, she'd worked hard all day, she swung onto the step of the bus, she grabbed her skirt with one hand, she clung to the railing of the bus with her other hand, and she wanted a dinner that was hot and strong and filling. Now, obviously, if your answer isn't there, go back and double check the extract. And if it does relate to Rosabelle specifically, you can still reward yourself a mark. It's a maximum of 4 marks. So if you've got more than 4, do not give yourself more than 4. The maximum marks is 4, so stop there once you've achieved the 4 marks. Okay, so that's the easy question done. Not much to say about that. It's really just to sort of ease you into the paper. Now, question 2 is a bit trickier. So I'm just going to go through a few things after teaching this for several years and being an examiner for the paper as well. Sort of key points to take note of. So the PED structure, so that's point, evidence, explain, develop, and doing that as separate paragraphs is not necessarily the best approach to this. The best responses actually tend to be sort of generally one large paragraph jumping from evidence to evidence and analysis to analysis. And that's a good strategy for saving time. That's something that I go through in part 1 of this series. The best responses make perceptive or detailed comments on effect and analysis. So the key part really of this question is you're commenting on the effect of language and analysing it, whether that's at a sentence level, a word level, or at a technique level. So really that is the key part, analysing thoroughly, as thoroughly as you possibly can. It's not a best fit approach when we're marking this. So what I mean by that is if your response is fantastic at the start and then sort of goes downhill and your last bit is not as good, you're not going to be penalised for that. You're going to get the marks as per the best part of your response. So let's say your first couple of sort of pieces of analysis are like 6 out of 8. You're not then going to go down to 4 out of 8 because the rest of it is not very good. It will remain at 6 out of 8. And that covers that second point just below that. So last point is techniques are not necessarily essential. So you don't need to think of the most fantastic techniques or spot them. You can just spot really simple things like the type of word, so adjective, adverb, verb, etc. And that's sort of enough to get you recognition that you're thinking about the writer's methods. You don't have to think of the most complex ones like juxtaposition, etc. It certainly won't hurt you, but it's not going to significantly impede you if you don't do that. Just try and identify at least at a word level the type of language that's being used. A couple of tips for this question then, now that you've completed it. So things to think about. A really good tip is to select 2 or 3 quotations to really zoom in on. So really expand and develop. Um, so you give the whole quotation, give a general idea, but then zoom in on keywords within that or key techniques that are being used. Um, the selected quotation should contain at least one word that you can say a couple of things about. It's just a really good basic strategy, and you can't go very wrong if you follow that. The language question is not about technique spotting. Some students fall into that trap. So they'll find a quotation, they'll say, oh, it uses this technique, but they fail in really talking about the effect of that technique. So although techniques might be mentioned by your teachers and they're in the mark scheme, the most important part is the effect. When we're marking this, that's what we're looking for more than anything. Not that you can spot a metaphor, but that you can say why it's being used and what the effect of it is. Okay. Um, and the bottom bullet point does not say use sophisticated techniques. It just says make sophisticated and accurate use of subject terminology, which is what I was talking about on the previous slide. So it's not the amazing technique that gets you the level 4, but it's actually what you say about it. So please bear that in mind when you're attempting this and have a look through your work and see if you've made those mistakes, see if you've focused too much on the technique and not enough on actually talking about the effect or the impact of that on the reader. Here's a little look at the mark scheme, and I've chosen for each question the sort of top and middle rather than anything in between to give you an idea of the differences. So if you can pause the video now and have a little look at the exemplars on the right hand side, but they give you a really good reference point upon which to sort of judge your own work. So what you should do is pause the video now, read through those examples on the right hand side and compare them to your own work and try and work out where you would fit on the mark scheme. Are you going to be around about level 2 or maybe creeping into level 3 if it's a little bit better but not quite level 4? Or are you heading in the level 4 area? Does your response sound like the one used in the level 4 exemplar? And you may even find that actually a lot of the ideas cross over with the ones you've used. So just going to go through a snippet from the examiner's report that was published after this series had taken place. And it's going to highlight maybe a few things that you've done or not done, and you may find yourself making sort of similar successes or errors. So let's just have a little read through this. So students who performed less well on this question often identified and labelled language features, but failed to comment on the effect on the reader or explain a reason behind the writer's choices. At times, they offered a basic generic comment. For example, it creates a picture in our heads, or it makes us feel like Rosabelle feels, which could apply to most examples of language in any line, and is merely a simple comment on the effect of language worthy of the mark in level 1. The key point there being avoid a simple generic explanation. Don't just say something generic like it creates a picture, it makes us feel how she feels. It needs to be far more specific. So what is she feeling? How does it make you feel specifically? Upset, angry, etc. Some students look for the connotations of words without a consideration of context, e.g. claiming that the word black in Rosabelle's petticoat being coated in black greasy mud was associated with death, darkness, or disease, or that the use of sibilants in the bus passengers sitting so still staring in front of them sounded like a snake hissing, that meant there was evil on the bus. Now, that's an interesting one because obviously you're really making an effort there if you're trying to look at those connotations. And you're going to get some marks for that, but it's not necessarily specific to how she is feeling or the atmosphere that is trying to be created. So it might be more appropriate that coated in black greasy mud, we would associate that with the fact that she's probably gone through a rather difficult journey and that she looks rather unpleasant now. And that she might feel unpleasant being covered in the greasy mud, not necessarily that we're associating her with death and darkness. So students need to understand that their comments have to be precise and contextualized in order to achieve level 3 or above. So if you want to get more than 5 marks, you've got to make sure that the comment is really relevant to the text itself and not just random connotations, etc. Okay, so we're going to move on to question 3 now, which I'd probably argue is the hardest question on the paper because structure is one of the skills that isn't necessarily focused on a great deal all the way through your time in school. And it is a hard thing to really think about because you're thinking about the whole of something and not just a part. It's a lot easier to pick apart a small thing, but it's a lot harder to think about the big picture. So on the left-hand side, I've got something that was taken from the exam board's further insights, and they were just trying to provide a couple of further insights into the do's and don'ts of this question. I'm going to talk about one of the traps that some students fall into, and that is that they focus on language analysis or sentence analysis or structure analysis rather than whole text analysis. So if you look at the example on the far left, um, this is an example of sentence level analysis. The sentence, what had awakened him was the noise from the storm, wind lashing the trees, rain on the rooftop, and thunder, is important because the list creates a cumulative effect of all the threatening noises that are combining to make Alex wake up. Each element of the wind, the rain, and then the thunder creates an increasingly violent picture of weather that nobody could possibly sleep through. That is a perfect response for a question 2. It's not a perfect response for a question 3 because you're not talking about the whole text and you're probably being too specific about individual things that are happening. Here's a much more appropriate answer for question 3. The sentence, there had been a lot of days like that since his mother got sick, is important because it is the first mention of his mother being ill. It reminds us of the nightmare at the beginning, and at this point we understand the meaning of it and that Alex is scared she is going to die. And that is specifically talking about how you're feeling at that point of the text, which is what this question is trying to get you to do. So here are some questions that the exam board also recommend that you consider when answering this question. So when I first start to read the text, what is the writer focusing my attention on? How is this being developed? What feature of structure is evident at this point? Why might the writer have deliberately chosen to begin the text with this focus and therefore make use of this particular feature? So to expand on that, the writer might have opened with a flashback. Why are they opening with a flashback? What's the impact of that? And then how does that relate to the rest of the text? What main points of focus does the writer develop in sequence after the starting point? So what is the writer going on to chronologically as we go through the extract, and why? What are we shifting to and what are we shifting from, and why is that happening? How is each point being developed? Why is the writer taking me through this particular sequence? How is this specific to helping me relate to the intended meaning? What does the writer focus my attention on at the end of the text? How is this developed as a structural feature? How am I left thinking or feeling at the end? And why might the writer have sought to bring me to this point of interest and understanding? Now, if you really struggled with this question, maybe go back to the paper, read through the extract again, and then think about these questions in your head as you go through. So why are things changing? Why are they happening? And the next slide is going to help you a little bit more with that. So general feedback from this question is that the best responses, obviously, as I've just said, considered the whole extract, so beginning, middle, and end, and anything in between. It's important to have quotations embedded. Commenting on sentence structure is not enough. As I said before, this should be for question 2. Comments on the following are what we're looking for. Any changes in tense, so past, present, future. Any change in perspective, how the setting might change and develop, and why. Any narrative shifts, so do we move on to a different thing happening? And we certainly do in this one that you did. And why does that happen? Is there a shift in focus on character, a shift in mood and tone? Again, those things certainly happen in the extract that you'd have looked at for this paper. There's definitely shifts in tone and mood and events that happen. And any repetitions of ideas and motifs or symbols. So is there any sort of symbol constantly appears throughout the extract? You might say for this one that we looked at, the sort of symbol of Rosabelle being downtrodden by the things around her, whether that be the bus, her clothing, her customers. It sort of is a repeating idea that happens throughout. And lastly, top tips for this question, think about the following. So there's several different ideas that you could think about. If you really struggled, have another go at this and look at this slide. Have this slide in front of you to give you an idea of the things you can pick out and talk about, okay? And lastly, a frame that could prove really helpful. So this isn't necessarily the correct way to answer your response, but if you really struggle, this will help you. So I've written a few sentence starters for you to follow that would really help you. So the author splits the extract into X amount of sections. In the first section, blah, blah, blah. Later, as the extract develops, blah, blah, blah. And finally, blah, blah, blah. So that's going to help you cover the bullet points of beginning, middle, and end. Now, obviously, where you've got those lines here, you would expect actually a whole section of analysis and talking about different ideas. It's not just a simple sentence you're putting in here. And these are the more specific ones to help you with that. So the author initially focuses our attention on and maybe embed the example, give the quotation. And then what is that emphasizing? What impact is that trying to create? What is it trying to show us? And then how does that change? So furthermore, the tone, mood of creating the open is X. This is achieved through, and give some quotations. Then you might move on to say, however, as the extract develops, our focus is then shifted to, give some examples and why that's happening. And a final piece of help. So if we look at this mark scheme, same as we did before, you can pause the video now and you can look at the exemplar on the right-hand side that will show you a top-level response from the exam board itself as to what they were looking for this question. So maybe compare your response and see if you fall into this category, or I'm going to move on to the next slide now. So pause if you want to stay here and read that. And then here is the level 2 response. So just go back in the video to which one you think you most match up with, and you can sort of award yourself some marks based on the one you think is most appropriate. Okay, so final thing, the examiner's report. I've just again taken a snippet from this that I thought was the most important thing that the examiner said. Some students found the bullet points. You could write about what the writer focuses your attention at the beginning of the source, how and why the writer changes the focus as the source develops, and any other structural features, effective as a framework for the responses. And that's something that I'm always telling my students. Follow those bullet points. They're there to guide you. Okay, so talk about beginning, middle, and end, how it changes and develops. It's quite simple if you just break it down like that. However, at times, although they use phrases such as at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end, which was perfectly valid, they just discussed the content of what was happening in the story at those points. So what students did, the mistake you might have made, is that you've just summarized and you haven't analyzed why those things are happening at those points. Okay, we don't just want to be retold with the examiners, with the teachers, we read it. Okay, we want to know why those things are happening at those points. Or the other mistake they made was that they just analyzed language features, which is something you're doing for question 2. So this question requires students to think about why something is placed at the beginning, middle, or end, not just what. Others identified features such as tone, setting, narrative perspective, and dialogue without explaining any shifts or changes in these features as the source developed, or the significance of their placement, which again led to a lack of focus and structure. If you mention that the tone shifts, why is it shifting and what is it showing us? Okay, so why does it suddenly go from a lighter to a darker atmosphere, and what are the examples for that, and why is it happening? Okay, on to question 4. So just a couple of key things to consider after all my years of teaching this. Responding to the bullet points is essential for this question. So look at those bullet points on the right-hand side. They're there to guide you, and they do differ slightly from the statement, so use them to your advantage. If it says to you, consider your own impressions of the red-haired girl, start off by talking about what your impressions are of the red-haired girl and what you think about her. The PED structure, point, evidence, explain, develop, is okay for this question because you have more time. So you can do separate paragraphs. You'll have the time to do that. So you can focus on one piece of evidence in one paragraph, and then you might move on to a different one, and it might agree or disagree, so you can sort of vary your argument. A mix of language and structural devices can be used in analysis, so it's sort of like a mixture of question 2 and 3. Embedding quotations throughout to support your argument response is recommended, and ensure enough time is allocated to the question. That's a huge one. Many students left this blank or did not give this enough time. That's a common thing that happens in all the years that I've taught this. Okay, so moving on, we're going to have a quick look at the mark scheme. Same process as before. Have a pause of the video and read through the exemplar on the right. How well do you match up with the top end here? Or if you're way off, do you match more in this level 2 or even lower? So pause the video, go to the one that you think you match up the most with. You might even at this point decide to level up your work. So if you did one that's a level 2, see if you can use some of the level 4 ideas in your own response and improve that. So some comments from the examiner. Again, I just took a key part from the examiner's report here, and I thought it was quite relevant to some of the things that I teach and that I say a lot of. So as with previous questions, the bullet points, we can use those bullet points to guide students on the focus of their evaluation. And I just said that before, that the bullet points are there to guide you, do follow them. But there were no right or wrong answers for this question. So most agreed that the girl had many advantages in life, but opinions varied as to whether Rosabelle was right to be angry. So this is a really interesting one. Sometimes students are taught to just agree because they generally the extracts lend themselves to that. But that's not the case. It is an open question, and you might actually disagree with the statement, and that's perfectly okay to do. As long as you justify why you don't think she's right to be angry and you can find evidence to support that and analyze that, that's fine to do. In fact, some of the best responses from Mark in this were actually a mixture of agree and disagree. So more able students offered a more considered response, suggesting that she wasn't right to be angry because the red-haired girl was perfectly nice to her, although it was understandable because the girl had so much, whilst Rosabelle had so little. Others suggested Rosabelle's anger was fueled by jealousy, or even that it wasn't really anger she was experiencing, but indignation at being treated like a mannequin, an inanimate object devoid of feelings. Many of the most able students thought the anger was justified, but misdirected, and also somewhat futile. It should have been aimed at Harry, who was demanding the impossible, or even at an unjust society that allowed such social inequality and division to exist, rather than the girl who was merely a product of her upbringing in much the same way as Rosabelle. And that's really what a top student would sort of be writing. That's not necessarily what you're going to be writing if you're just going for level 2 or level 3. All evaluations and interpretations were valid as long as they were rooted in the text. So that point there is, as long as you're using the evidence from the text to support your ideas and your answers, then it's going to really help you. So on to section B, just a couple of things to take note of. So best responses for this are generally a mixture of interesting narrative and description. It's neither one nor the other. You may have been taught to do one or the other, and that might be the right process for you if you really struggle. For example, your teacher might just say, look, your strength is describe, stick to doing a more descriptive piece, and don't include really any narrative. But that will limit you in the mark scheme. If you want to be getting the top marks for this response, you need to have some sort of story elements mixed with description, much like a real book in real life. You know, great books that we read are a mixture of good description and good plot and narrative. They're not just one or the other. Marks are awarded for the highest point reached. So if you do a fantastic first page, but your second page is not so good, that's fine. You're not going to be down marked for that as such. It just means that whatever the marks you've got up until that point, they'll stay there. So you get marks for the highest point reached in your response. But the structure is more of an average for the second part of the marks. So student receives a minimum mark in band 5. Exams are double marked. So your teacher should mark it once for the first set of marks and then again for your technical accuracy. You shouldn't be doing both at the same time. So maybe just double check if your teacher's done that for you. Many students, or some students rehearse, so in the real exam, some students rehearse their response and they memorize a response. That's not going to be relevant for you for a walking talking mock, and I do advise against it. Although you can, memorize the opening of a bad weather and a good weather description, and they can apply to lots of different questions. That can be a good strategy to do. And your technical accuracy can make a tremendous difference. So proofread your work at the end. Make sure you've checked your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. If you haven't done that, do that now, because that can make a massive difference to the amount of marks you get for this. You could write an average story, but if you're really technically accurate, it's going to bump your marks up massively. Likewise, if you've done a fantastic story, but your technical accuracy is letting you down, you're going to lose a lot of marks for no reason whatsoever. So some top tips, these are a bit generic, but they can really help you if you struggle. So just using descriptive features is really important because that's what creates imagery and it's what makes something interesting to read. So you might decide to sort of, if you're really struggling with this, try and include an X amount of devices per paragraph to make sure you're ticking those boxes. But if you're going for the top end, try not to think about that too much because that might hold you back a little bit actually. Try and use the senses, describe every noun and verb, so use adverbs, use adjectives all the time wherever possible. Vary your sentence lengths for impact, use paragraphs, vary your punctuation choices, and describe everything in as much detail as you possibly can. So last but not least, the final bit of the examiner's report for question 5. I'll just read this out loud. The most able students wrote beautifully crafted imaginative responses, both descriptive and narrative. It was stunning in their accomplishment, original, engaging, and delightful to read. And that was just what I was saying a second ago. The best responses are a perfect mix of descriptive elements and narrative. So try and aim for that if you possibly can. The addition of a reading question focusing on structure had obviously encouraged some students to consider the shape of their own writing. But when you're answering question 3 and you're analysing how the writers use structure, hopefully you might think about that yourself when you're writing your response. Are you using clever overall structural features? Have you got flashbacks? Are you changing the tone and mood? Are you changing the pace? You should think about those things if you want to increase your marks for the structure of your response. There isn't too much else to say. Those are the key things I wanted to pick out for the examiner's report. But certainly pause this video and have a little look through the rest of those comments. It talks a little bit about planning and how students can really benefit from good plans, etc. You can download all of these on the internet for yourself if you just type in AQA English Language. The top link should sort of take you to different assessment materials, and you can look through all of the past mark schemes, examiner reports. If you're really keen on improving your exam response, go and check those resources out and they'll help you. And you can also go on YouTube, and there's lots of other probably far better YouTubers than me who talk through each different question and approaches to them. Certainly recommend Mr. Bruff, for example. Obviously, I'll be looking to add these to my channel as time goes on, and I've got a few on there already. But this was just a general walking, talking mock feedback for the paper that you did in the previous video. So that takes us to the end. Hopefully you found some of that useful. Please pop any questions you've got about the paper that you attempted in the comments section. And I'll be looking to do more developed, sort of a more developed look at different questions on both paper 1 and paper 2 in further videos in the series. So thank you for watching.